In 1807, the British Empire banned the Atlantic slave trade. Other nations followed soon after. On paper, it looked like the system was ending. Like one of the darkest chapters in human history was finally coming to a close. But that's not what happened, because even after abolition, the ships kept sailing. Men, women, and children were still being captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic. Not openly, but secretly. Not legally, but profitably. This is the part of history most people ever learn. By the early 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had already been operating for hundreds of years. Millions of Africans had been taken across the ocean. Entire economies had been built on their labor. But opposition to the trade was growing. Formerly enslaved people, writers, and religious groups began speaking out against it. They exposed the brutality of the system and pushed for change. In Britain, this pressure led to a major decision. In 1807, the government passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade. This meant British ships were no longer allowed to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Over time, other nations followed. On the surface, it looked like the beginning of the end. But the reality was more complicated. These laws did not end slavery itself. They only targeted the trade, the transportation of enslaved people. Those already enslaved in the Americas remained in bondage. Plantations continued to operate, and the demand for labor remained high. This created a contradiction. The trade was illegal, but the system that depended on it was still in place. As long as plantations needed workers, there was still an incentive to supply them. And where there is demand, a supply will find a way. By the early 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had already been operating for hundreds of years. Millions of Africans had been taken across the ocean. Entire economies had been built on their labor. But opposition to the trade was growing. Formerly enslaved people, writers, and religious groups began speaking out against it. They exposed the brutality of the system and pushed for change. In Britain, this pressure led to a major decision. In 1807, the government passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade. This meant British ships were no longer allowed to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Over time, other nations followed. On the surface, it looked like the beginning of the end. But the reality was more complicated. These laws did not end slavery itself. They only targeted the trade, the transportation of enslaved people. Those already enslaved in the Americas remained in bondage. Plantations continued to operate, and the demand for labor remained high. This created a contradiction. The trade was illegal, but the system that depended on it was still in place. As long as plantations needed workers, there was still an incentive to supply them. And where there is demand, a supply will find a way. The illegal slave trade did not continue on its own. It was sustained by a network of people across continents who all had something to gain from it. European traders were still deeply involved. Even after abolition laws were passed, many continued operating in secret. Some used foreign flags to disguise their identity. Others worked through intermediaries to avoid direct responsibility. Profit remained the driving force. As long as enslaved labor produced wealth in the Americas, there were those willing to supply it. In the Americas, plantation owners played a major role in keeping the system alive. They needed workers to maintain production, and hiring free labor was often seen as more expensive. So instead of adapting, many chose to continue relying on enslaved Africans, even if it meant breaking the law. Ports in places like Brazil and Cuba became major entry points for the illegal trade. Ships arrived quietly. Cargo was unloaded quickly, and records were often falsified or not kept at all. Corruption also played a role. Officials who were supposed to enforce the ban sometimes accepted bribes. Inspections were ignored. Ships were allowed to pass. The system survived not just because of demand, but because enforcement was weak. Within Africa, some local traders and intermediaries were also involved. As in earlier periods, individuals and groups participated in capturing and selling people, often as prisoners of war or through raids. But again, this activity was driven by external demand. The scale and intensity of the trade were shaped by the global market, not just local actions. This is important to understand. The Atlantic slave trade was not controlled by a single group. It was a connected system linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And even after it was banned, that system did not disappear. It adjusted. It became less visible, more secretive. But it continued because too many people were still benefiting from it. After banning the slave trade in 1807, Britain took on a new role. It began trying to stop the trade it had once helped dominate. To do this, the British government deployed naval forces along the West African coast. This effort became known as the West Africa Squadron. Its mission was simple in theory: find slave ships, stop them, free those on board. Over time, the squadron captured hundreds of ships and freed thousands of Africans. But despite these efforts, the trade continued, because stopping it was far more difficult than it seemed. The Atlantic Ocean was vast. Patrolling such a large area with limited ships was a constant challenge. Slave traders knew this. They adapted by changing routes, sailing at night, and avoiding known patrol zones. Speed also became an advantage. Illegal slave ships were often designed to move quickly, making them harder to intercept. Even when ships were captured, enforcement was complicated. Legal processes were slow. Evidence had to be proven, and different countries had different rules about what counted as an illegal ship. Some nations cooperated with Britain, others did not. This created gaps in enforcement that traders could exploit. There were also political limits. Britain could not simply stop and search every ship at sea. Doing so risked conflict with other nations. So many vessels passed without inspection. And even when enslaved people were freed, their future was uncertain. Some were resettled in places like Sierra Leone. Others faced new forms of hardship and instability. So while naval patrols did have an impact, they did not end the trade. They reduced it. They disrupted it. But they could not fully stop a system that was still profitable and still in demand. By the mid-19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had been illegal for decades. But illegal did not mean finished. Ships were still crossing the ocean. People were still being captured and sold. The system was weaker, but it was still active. So what finally caused it to decline? There was no single moment when it suddenly ended. Instead, it faded over time, under pressure from multiple forces. One factor was increased enforcement. Naval patrols became more consistent. More ships were intercepted. The risks for traders continued to rise. At the same time, international pressure grew. Countries began signing agreements to restrict the trade. Even nations that had resisted enforcement earlier began to face consequences. But enforcement alone was not enough. Economic changes also played a role. In some regions, the reliance on enslaved labor began to shift. Industrialization in parts of Europe changed how wealth was produced. And in some places, wage labor slowly began to replace forced labor. However, this shift was uneven and slow. In places like Brazil, the illegal slave trade continued deep into the 19th century. Brazil remained one of the largest destinations for enslaved Africans long after other countries had reduced their involvement. It wasn't until 1888 that Brazil officially abolished slavery. This is a key point. Even though the transatlantic trade had been banned decades earlier, slavery itself still existed. And as long as slavery continued, the demand for labor remained. So the end of the slave trade was not a clean break. It was a gradual decline, shaped by enforcement, economics, and political pressure. And even then, it did not bring immediate freedom or equality. It simply marked the beginning of another transition. By the late 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had largely come to an end. On paper, the system was over. Laws had been passed. Ships had been stopped. Slavery had been abolished in most parts of the Atlantic world. But ending the trade did not mean ending its impact. And it did not mean the system simply disappeared, because many of the structures built during that time remained in place. After abolition, formerly enslaved people were often left without land, resources, or protection. They were free, but with limited opportunities. In many regions, new systems were created that continued to control labor. These systems were not always called slavery, but they often produced similar conditions. In the United States, laws and practices enforced racial segregation for decades after slavery ended. One example is the system of Jim Crow laws. These laws restricted movement, rights, and access to resources. In other parts of the world, different forms of labor exploitation emerged. Indentured labor systems brought workers from Asia and other regions under harsh conditions. Colonial rule expanded across Africa, reshaping economies and political structures. So while the transatlantic trade ended, control over labor and resources continued, just in new forms. This is the part of history that is often simplified. Abolition is presented as a clear ending, a moment where the system stopped and freedom began. But in reality, it was a transition from one system to another. Understanding this doesn't take away from the importance of abolition. It was a major turning point. But it also wasn't the final chapter, because the effects of the Atlantic slave trade did not end in the 19th century. They continued to shape societies economically, socially, and politically. And in many ways, they still do. If this changed how you see history, subscribe to Dark History Files for more untold Black history. And don't stop here. Watch the first part of the story next.